So, as I said, we're going to be now jumping into future things. This is a rapid overview, okay? Every single thing that we're dealing with today, we're going to come back again. This is like going through the table, thumbing through the table of contents really quickly, and then we're going to get into it in much more detail. So some of these definitions you'll see again, most of the charts and things. But I've learned over the years that a quick overview is always helpful, and at least get familiar with it. Now, some of the terms and things hopefully you've learned along the way, since this is the last ST class that you have to take. The Exploring Christian Theology thing was also written to introduce you to concepts, terms, distinctions within various views, so that at least we're all speaking the same language, having the same vocabulary. But this is the chance to sort of iron out some of the vocabulary differences and what do we mean by these terms and positions. But don't forget, we will be digging deeply into these as we go. This kind of becomes the outline for the rest of this course. I have, from the day I first began teaching eschatology, when I teach eschatology or end times or Book of Revelation in church, I do it chronologically. Basically, most end times books, or in fact eschatology classes, when they get to future things, they basically say, here's the next thing that's going to happen according to my understanding of prophecy, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. They're going basically chronologically, following a timeline. And there's some benefit to that, especially if you're in a community where they have a distinct timeline, a position, and they're more or less on board, and you're just kind of walking them through what you believe Scripture is setting forth. There's a lot of sense to that. On the other hand, in a class like this, I'm building a case, okay? I am presenting an argument, a thesis, and trying to walk you through it, and I'm trying to persuade you of my perspective. So in order to do that, I'm following a logical outline rather than a chronological. So the way we're going to treat this for the rest of the semester is we're going to ask the first two questions, which are very closely related. In fact, when we get into the digging deeper in this, I'm going to put them together. But in Christian theology, historically, especially in the modern period, they're not always treated together, so we'll look at these separate today. Is Christ's return literal? That's the first question, first of 5 crucial questions. It's almost like a flow chart. Did you ever see these flow charts? Blah, 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 yes or no. If yes, you go this way. If no, you go that way. And then you have options within it. It's sort of like that. It's almost like an eschatological choose-your-own-adventure. It's choose-your-own eschatology. Now, the problem is, if you answer no to questions 1 and 2, you are that rare thing called an eschatological heretic. It is actually possible to deviate significantly from orthodox eschatology. But eschatology, orthodox eschatology, that which has been believed everywhere, always and by all, which is clear in Scripture, which every tradition of the Christian faith has taught, which all Protestants and evangelicals hold in common, it's pretty minimalistic. It's like, minimal. It's a few, you can count on, 3 fingers. It's Christ is returning as judge and king. Like literally coming back as judge and king. There's going to be a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked, and eternal life and eternal condemnation. Those things have been held by everybody. And so when you deviate from that, related to eschatological events, the literal future return of Christ, you're in trouble. Everything built upon that is where, within orthodoxy, Christians have differed and have different perspectives. How you answer each question does affect then how you will answer the other questions following it. There's a logical progression here. And I'm going to suggest that, number 1, you better be orthodox first of all. You can't graduate from here if you don't believe in the future return of Christ. But the next question then, okay, he's coming back as judge and king. He's going to raise the dead, usher in, a restoration of creation. That's normal orthodox understanding of eschatology. But how's that going to work out? What does the chart look like? What's the timeline look like? Then the next question I'm going to ask is his return going to be premillennial? If you answer no, you have a couple of options there. If you answer yes, then we move on to the next question, and it actually affects how you answer that next question, because your understanding of the millennium and its purpose, we're not just answering yes or no, but, okay, yes, there's a millennium, but why? What's the purpose of that? What's the nature of the millennium? And then the purpose of that feeds back to, well, then what's the purpose and nature of the coming tribulation, if that's yet future? And how you answer the millennial question affects how you will answer the tribulation question. Then, if you answer the millennium question and the tribulation question like me and understand the relationship between these two and how it relates to the story, the rapture question almost begins to answer itself. Okay? Almost. And then but that's the question we're going to answer last. Do not be confused, however. I'm not presenting a chronological order here, right? First, Jesus is going to come, then there's going to be a millennium, then a tribulation, and then a rapture. I mean, I don't know anybody who holds that order. So understand what this is. This is a lot. That's why I don't have it sideways, right? To make it confusing. They're building upon each other. So the crucial questions: is the return of Christ literal? Is the return of Christ future? Is the return of Christ premillennial? Is the tribulation period future? And is the rapture coming before the tribulation? Those are the questions that we're going to answer in that order. That's the outline for the rest of the course. And it, as you can see, kind of moves from most significant to least significant. And it's kind of like a train. Have you ever gotten on a train after a sporting event? Ever done this? I do this. I don't park anymore at the American Airlines Center. I'll never do that again. Unless I'm, going with somebody who has like box seats in a, drives a Lexus and parks in the VIP parking. Then I'll park with them. But you get on the train and you're stuffed, right? But eventually at each stop, some people getting off, right? It becomes a little bit easier each stop. And pretty soon you make it all the way to the end. You might be the last person in the train if you go to the end of the line. It's kind of like how these work. Everybody's stuffed into number 1 and 2, or you're not Orthodox. Some people, and some of you might, not be completely unpersuaded by my premillennial position in arguments. You might get off. So you're hold to the literal future return of Christ, you're Orthodox, but you're not premillennial. You might be premillennial, you might have a different understanding of the future nature of the tribulation. You might get off there. You might get all the way through my understanding of the future tribulation in general and not stick with me on the pre-tribulation rapture, have a different view on that. So all of those scenarios are possible. And I've never had a class where everybody, 100% of them, made it all the way to the end. But if you make it to the end, I'll give you a special prize. So here we go. Let's do the literal return of Christ first. What do we mean by literal return of Christ? That Jesus is actually coming back, and by actually means you can take a picture of it. That's what we mean. This is the question that came up in modern liberal theological circles with regard to the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah, I believe in the resurrection. Do you really? Yes, I really believe in the resurrection of Jesus. What do you mean by that? I believe he was raised. If I were standing outside the tomb that Sunday morning around 6 a.m. or so, wherever it was, and was there with a camera and was taking pictures, would I have been able to take a picture of the resurrection of Jesus? Well, that's a different question. No, that's what we've always meant by actually resurrected. Same thing is true about the return. Could you take a picture of it? And that's what we mean by a literal return rather than a future return. So remember, the Christian tradition has always held to this, a literal, physical, real, future, actual return of Christ. And then comes people, not just him, he wasn't the first, he was the godfather, he was not the father of liberal theology, but he's going to stand in, Otto von Harnack. The return of Christ is a myth. It may be illustrating some spiritual truth, but it's not really going to happen in any scenario. In fact, Jesus is dead. Revealed fact would be C.I. Scofield, and notice I call this the conservative traditionalist view. This is the view that the church has always held, the physical, literal return of Christ. You do have, out of this, kind of a, mediating position, Rudolf Bultmann. Neoliberal or neo-orthodox is part of the spectrum. And they would say, well, you can speak in terms of the return of Christ. It is a myth, but it's a meaningful myth. It's not meaningless. It's not vacuous. It means something to us spiritually or existentially or affectively. It's like Aesop's fables aren't literally true, but there's truth involved there that affects you. And so this is no literal return. This is a literal return of Christ. So be careful. We have, in the modern era, we have this phenomenon of confessing with the same exact language as traditional conservative Christianity, the return of Christ, or the resurrection of Jesus, or some of these, the deity of Christ. But if you start asking questions, probing questions, you realize that they are of a different spirit. They have a different view on these things. So what we're talking about is you could take a picture of it, okay? So we're not saying, well, the kingdom of God comes by coming to the individual, entering into his soul, laying hold of it. Jesus returns when he comes into your heart. No, that's not what we mean. That's not literal return of Christ. Yes, sir.
On the previous slide,
Yep.
where would you put Albert? Is it Schweitzer?
Schweitzer?
Yeah, kind of right in between.
Yeah,
there.
over
Okay,
here.
That's
It's kind of meaningful. It's kind of not true.
yeah.
Kind of true, kind of not.
Okay.
Depending on what you mean by true. Yeah. I mean, everybody can. Everybody's somewhere on the spectrum here. I mean, we're over here. Those evangelicals who, yes, they believe in a rapture, but they take it figuratively. They're still over here. They're somewhere kind of here in the middle. They're not denying the resurrection. They're not denying the return of Christ, like literally, really. They're just taking certain descriptions of that more figuratively. Okay, so in this case, you couldn't take a picture of it, right? That's not something you can actually see. You feel it. You feel it. It informs you and transforms you. Okay, so is the return of Christ literal? Oh, liberal. It's a Freudian slip. It's where we're headed here, right? If you say no, congratulations, you win the prize of being that very rare thing, a eschatological heretic, okay? It is possible. You have to really work hard to commit heresy in eschatology. But by answering no, you can do that. Now, what would they say? Remember, they still want to call themselves a Christian. They still want to speak about the return of Christ, but in a figurative sense. Well, some would say Christ returned, quote unquote, at the coming of the Spirit. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. Jesus said that, right? By means of the Spirit. Matthew 28:10. 28:20. What does that say? I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Well, if he's with us somehow and he's ascended to heaven, he's returned to us by means of the Spirit. And that's it. Now, is that true? Has Christ come to us by means of his Spirit? Is he present with us by means of the Spirit in any meaningful? Yes, that's true. So the problem with this isn't that it's not true, it's just not the whole truth. And that's the problem with most false teaching. Most false teaching is that this in itself, this claim is not necessarily untrue. It's part of the truth, treated mutually exclusively and in opposition to other aspects of the truth. It's not the whole truth. It's the problem of reductionism. They reduced the return of Christ to just this, he is with us and abiding with us and we are in union with him by means of the Spirit. We can't do that. Or you might say Christ returned to believers individually, personal encounter or conversion. Remember Paul, right? Paul becomes then paradigmatic. You may not be able to see it in your case, but you met Jesus and he came to you just as really as he did to Paul when he knocked him off the horse that is in all the paintings but not in the narrative. Right? He got knocked off his high horse. No horse in the narrative. But oh well. But there he is. Jesus has come to him, right? Oh, Lord, sir, who are you? I'm Jesus. Oh, no. What have I been doing? Well, he's going back through this. Okay, so he returned to to earth. And by the way, if you read the book of Acts and other of Paul's writings, that wasn't the only time Paul had a personal, physical encounter with Jesus. He kept coming back. He appears to him, and he comes to him, and he says to him, okay? But in any case, that's what we mean in conversion. So if you've met Jesus, if you've been converted, he's returned. I don't think that accounts for all of the passages that talk about the return of Christ. Christ returns to take each believer to heaven. So when you die, John 14:3, some people, some traditions of interpreting that are, I go to prepare a place, and if I go, I'm going to come back to take you to where I am, so that where I am, you may be also. There's something going on there, is that when we die individually, hey, welcome home, and he brings you to, here's what I have prepared for you. If you would have done more evangelism, you'd have a bigger spot, bigger place, but, here it is. He's taking you. He's returning to you, kind of meeting you halfway at death. Others take that as a reference to the rapture, or something that happens at his physical return. Okay, well, all right. But what they're doing here is holding this in exclusion to everything else. It's a illegitimate totality transfer. Here's what the return, he comes to us. Here's what it means in this text. Well, that's what it figuratively means in all of the passages related to his coming. You can't do that. If you say yes, congratulations, you are almost there. You're almost orthodox. There's just one more question you have to answer. You get to go to question 2. The question 2 is it future? Because not only has the church always confessed that Christ's return is literal and real and going to happen in history, this rude intrusion into the world's rebellion, it's going to happen in the future. It hasn't happened in the past. That's a clear position of orthodoxy from day one on. Doesn't mean certain prophecies of Jesus or the apostles or even the book of Revelation haven't been partially fulfilled, or even some of them completely fulfilled in the past. Futurism is open to this idea that some things have been fulfilled in the past, but not the return of Christ as judge and king. That has not yet been fulfilled. In fact, you can believe everything else has been fulfilled except that, and you're still okay. But there are some people who push the return of Christ, the physical, literal return of Christ, or a figurative sense of that fulfills all of the passages referring to physical return, into the past. Okay, is the return of Christ future? If you say no, you fall into what we're going to call preterism, but probably a better label would be hyperpreterism, extreme preterism. What does preterism mean? Right, what does that mean? Already happened. It already happened. Okay, now you can be a preterist with regard to, say, the Olivet Discourse. Right? You know what the Olivet Discourse is?
Yep.
Okay, where Jesus is talking about, he asks, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? Well, this will happen, that'll happen. And it sounds a lot like what's going to happen in the next 30, 40 years with the first Jewish revolt and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And if those things have already happened, preterist, then we should not expect a future fulfillment of that. Now, there's an assumption that there's only one fulfillment, and there's certain things operating there that may or may not be true, but that's the position. Doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus isn't coming back in the future to resurrect the dead and establish his kingdom. Okay, so you can be a partial preterist. So there is this couple forms of preterism, and you have to be careful. If someone comes to you and says, I'm a preterist, do not necessarily assume heretic. Usually they'll say, I'm a partial preterist, because they don't want to be a heretic. Seriously. The partial preterists are sometimes the severest critics of the full preterists, or the hyper-preterists, okay? So partial preterism. So preterism A is Christ coming in judgment. So even the language of his coming in the clouds and glory with his angels, this they will say generally. Some will say, well, that's the future aspect. But many will say, well, that's using Old Testament figurative language of Christ coming in judgment, visiting in judgment. And because God judges through means, Yahweh doesn't get on a spiritual horse and come down and, this glowing flame. He sends the Assyrians, or he sends the Babylonians. And he Joel, he's leading his army, right? In a figurative sense. The judgment's real, and God is orchestrating it, but that's the imagery that they'll say is going on in the Olivet Discourse, and even in some Revelation passages. So Christ coming in judgment was already fulfilled in AD 67 to 70 at the destruction of Jerusalem, or either or in addition to the second Jewish revolt, AD 132, 135, during the Bar Kokhba revolt. You'll see different variations even of this. A handful, hyperpreterism will say that fulfills all of it. I have even read some hyperpreterists or full preterists that would say the resurrection even happened then. And so what does that where does that leave us? Well, when you die, that's all there is. When you die, you're resurrected, you go to heaven, and you enter into the fullness of salvation. That's the soteriological effect of that. Eschatology then is only personal eschatology, what happens to you when you die. Way outside the bounds of what the church has always believed. Every tradition of the church. Partial preterism, this is just related to certain events of the Olivet Discourse. There is still some future events to occur. Yeah, future. Christ returning, establishing. They may even say there will be another kind of tribulation similar to what Jesus describes in the Olivet Discourse, which becomes a historical type of the ultimate rebellion. That's partial preterism. There have been partial preterists through most of church history. That is an orthodox position. Okay? Questions about the distinction between full preterism and partial preterism or anything else? You had your hand up. Did I answer it?
Not so much. So when you talk about the future return of Christ, are you talking about future from the perspective of John writing Revelation, or future from us?
Depends. In full preterism, generally speaking, this was fulfilled in the AD 70-ish, or the 130s, which we would say Revelation was written in the 90s, but they can't say that, because then it becomes a quote-unquote prophecy of something that happened in the past. And so they date Revelation in the 60s. They have to. So from the author's perspective, from Jesus and the author's perspective, it was still yet future. So it was a real supernatural prophecy, but then subsequently has already been fulfilled.
So then is that still a heresy? Because they're still affirming...
No, the problem, it wouldn't be a heresy if they didn't include the actual return of Christ to earth and resurrection and all of that as all past events. Every creed, every confession, every Bible verse, every church father, every reformer, everybody has always understood that Jesus Christ is still coming again. He will come again to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. Full preterists are absolutely rejecting that. It's yet future. This world is still waiting something. You had your hand up, Darren.
So I'll hear folks in our tradition, when they'll refer to somebody uncharitably as a preterist, they're still probably just a partial preterist.
Yeah, they probably just a partial preterist. I won't treat partial preterists uncharitably. My kids go to this Christian school in Dallas, a Presbyterian school. Within Presbyterianism, there are a variety of views, okay? But his view, the pastor there and the principal of the school, and he teaches Bible and such there, he's a partial preterist postmillennialist, which is great. You know, my kids come home like, I have no idea what he's talking about. Like, me neither. But one day he was teaching like end time stuff in their Bible class, okay? So my daughter came home, she said, I don't understand what, I'm not going to say his name since this is being recorded. I don't understand what he was saying because he said he's a predatorist. I said, I don't think that's what he said. And I actually put that on Facebook, that my daughter came home and said that her teacher is a predatorist. And he's friends with me, and he wrote back, he said, and I believe in the raptor. It was great. But, that totally doesn't bother me. He very clearly says, I'm not a full preterist. Christ is coming back, and I share that with every other Nicene Orthodox Christian that has ever lived. So, full or hyper-preterism is a minority and fringe view. Okay? But you will meet them. And they want to be considered Orthodox Christians as well. And there are lines. Okay? I'm sorry. There are lines that we draw, and we have to draw them firmly. Yeah, Tori.
What would be the motive for taking that position? Like, where does that come from?
That's a great question. They do have wild charts that map it out and plan. I mean, you think our charts are complex. Those are very, very complex. But part of it is, for full preterism, you mean?
Yeah.
There is obviously a low regard for the authority of the creeds. They don't regard those as authoritative, number one. At least not when the whole thing. So they feel the freedom to actually make arguments biblically, historically, that are outside of the Orthodox confession. But also there is a pendulum kind of swinging against radical sensationalism. And you think that there's going to be a rapture, Jesus coming back? Well, in fact, not. It's quite the opposite. Okay, preterism B. There's another variety of this. Christ's coming in the kingdom was fulfilled non-literally. Really, but not. You couldn't take a picture of it unless you were in the heavenly realm. No, sorry. It would not be a picture as much as it would be a long documentary. Okay, you're seeing it in history unfold. In the 4th and 5th centuries, with the defeat of paganism and heresy by the Catholic Church, there is this brand of this, so that it's not so much that it's fulfilled in the Bar Kokhba or the first Jewish revolt there, and that around the turn of the 1st to 2nd century. The coming kingdom, Christ coming in kingdom, not so much in judgment directly, but in the kingdom is the conversion of Constantine and the end of the persecutions. The tribulation is now over, and the kingdom has been ushered in. It's a form of realized eschatology or realized millennialism. And they will see this as fulfilling a lot of these passages regarding the kingdom. However, every one of those, this was very popular in parts of the medieval period, parts of the Reformation, and even among post-millennialists in the modern era. However, these people did not deny a future return of Christ as judge and king and the resurrection and all of those things that are part of the creed. So this would not be a heresy. It was just a different way of putting the thing together. There's another form. Christ's coming in the kingdom was for a long time future, but has at least partially been fulfilled in recent history. And you see this among what they call the Adventist movement coming out of the 19th century. Not all of them. Well, the idea is, look, the problem was they set dates. Jesus didn't come back. Some reset dates. Some said, well, that was stupid. We shouldn't have reset date. We shouldn't have set dates in the beginning. But some of them held tenaciously to that date. And even though nothing changed in the world around them, there's no evidence that Jesus returned, they couldn't let go of that date. The math works out, even though Jesus said it's impossible to do it. But hey, what does he know? Jesus returned in heaven. Okay? So you'd have to have a special camera that could see what was going on in heaven. And so is Christ sitting on David's throne and reigning yet? Well, they would say, well, up to that point, not yet. But at that date, whatever the date was, because it kept changing, depending on the group, Christ took his seat and began his reign in heaven. However, he will eventually come again, and that throne will be on earth as well. There is still even a future return for most of these. But it's this kind of in between. So that per se, if that was the only problem that Jehovah's Witnesses had, it would not be enough to put them out of the bounds of orthodoxy. Unfortunately, they more or less deny every single other position of Christian theology that is true. The Seventh-day Adventists, they were among the same group. Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and several other groups all kind of grew out of the same Adventist movement. So that's how you would say no to Christ's return is yet future. If you say yes, Christ's return is literal and mostly future, because when we come back to this and we talk about preterism, I'm going to show you that all futurists are partial preterists with regard to certain prophecies, the elements of the Olivet Discourse, these kinds of things. There are some elements that all futurists say have begun to occur in some sense. Almost every futurist that reads Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, where he says, these stones, not a stone will be left upon each other, which will not be cast down. When they're on tours in Israel, they're pointing at the stones. Every one of them. Never seen an exception to that. Well, that would be a partial preterist, even if it's just limited to the stones of the temple. It's still something that was yet future when Jesus prophesied it, that is part of a fulfillment in the past. And I'll defend that. I'll show that to you. But so really it is how much already and how much not yet, once again. For futurists, I identify myself as a futurist. That means it's already in small caps and like 10-point font with regard to these issues, but bold, underline, italics, large cap, future, not yet. If you say yes, you can move on to the next. You're Orthodox. There's a literal future return of some sort. Then the question is, well, what does that look like? I mean, you could get by with being what they call the pan-millennialist. It'll all pan out in the end. And you would still be Orthodox, and many, many people in your church will be like this. I really don't care about that. However it works out, it's fine with me. On the other hand, there's a story that we've been talking about, and this plan of personal as well as redemption of this creation and bringing it back and all. And if you stop at just a literal future return, you have it's like watching Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. And then well, what happens next? Well, it all works out and the good side wins. Oh, okay. I don't need to see that last movie then. Well, it's not the last one anymore. Right? Well, that's not satisfying. You want it to wrap up. You want it to be concluded in some meaningful way. And that's where the details do become important. And they're given to us. So now the question is, when he returns, he's coming back as judge and king, what does that look like? Okay? So is the return of Christ premillennial? That is, he's coming back literally, it's yet future, we're somewhere on this timeline here, and it is yet future. After that, will there be an initial stage of his eternal reign that lasts roughly 1,000 years? That may be just a round number, but we don't know. But there's a phase of the kingdom that is punctuated by the first resurrection of the righteous and the final rebellion and a second resurrection of the wicked. Is that going to happen? So if you say no, there are several options. All here within the bounds of Orthodox eschatology, right? You can hold these things and still be a Christian, and there's sometimes disproportionate distribution of these positions, various parts of history. But amillennialism, Christ is currently reigning in heaven with the saints or through the church. The variations of amillennialism, just as there are variations of premillennialism and postmillennialism. So I'm just giving you a very general kind of a hook, but you have to understand we can fill this in. So it's this placeholder. Satan is now bound. He was bound at the cross or at the resurrection or something like this. Christ will return for general resurrection and judgment in the future. That's going to happen. And Revelation 19, 11 through 21, and I saw heaven open and a man on, Christ on the horse, the logos, the word of God. He comes back with the armies of heaven and he slays the beast and the false prophet and the dragon, binds them and puts them in the... That happened... the binding is a different passage. That happens in verse 1. So he comes back. It's the end of the future return. Then Revelation 20 goes back to the beginning and recapitulates and tells the same story from a different angle. Revelation 20, 1 through 6 is a spiritual resurrection. 27 through 15 recapitulates the return of Christ. It's not one continuous vision. Forget that. You don't need to know all about that. We'll come back to it in great detail. But the resulting chart is this. The ascension, Well, I don't know why the ascension's on the other side of that. Sorry. Cross should be on the other side. But ascension, and then the return. Satan is spiritually bound at the cross. Spiritual resurrection of believers. General resurrection for judgment. General resurrection, we mean everybody. Righteous, wicked, Old Testament, everybody. Every human who has ever lived will be resurrected, some to eternal life, some to eternal death. And then the eternal state begins, the eternal kingdom. Post-millennialism, the church will usher in a golden age, the millennium, through Christianizing the world. There are variations of this as well that we'll get into later. Some are more militant, some are more evangelical, that is, evangelistic gospel preaching, and that's how the world's going to be transformed. Some are more social, some are more political, some are more kind of following the pattern of revival. Many are, the post-millennial pastor at my kid's church, he's what we would call an evangelistic post-millennialist, and says, no, we're not going to take over the political and social institutions. You don't vote for the lesser of two evils, who's going to more likely promote Christian values. God is going to do it. There's a strong emphasis on God doing this in his own timing and working this out, and we are to be faithful and do, But there are other people who say, no, we are to transform culture and society and politics much more actively. And it might mean making some compromises. It's not going to be perfect. Others have said, yes, the kingdom is to be ushered in, and we're going to do it by force. It's militaristic or millennialism, okay? But so there have been various forms of it. So the key element is we, by some mechanism or the Spirit working through us or something like this, we're going to usher in a golden age on earth prior to the final rebellion and return of Christ. Satan is now and increasingly bound. There's a lot of already not yet, but increasingly he is being bound as the gospel goes forth and the kingdom is being further and further established. There will be a future apostasy. In most forms of post-millennialism, there will be a falling away and a release of Satan, and he's going to gather the Gog and Magog, and there will be a final revolt, something like a tribulation. Christ will then return for general resurrection and judgment at the end of that golden age, which kind of declines with the apostasy. So the ascension, present church age, world is gradually Christianized. The kingdom gradually is established. Once it's established, you have not perfection, but a world of relative justice and peace and harmony. And Satan being progressively bound by the church. Then there's a general resurrection after the rebellion at the return of Christ physically. So the return of Christ is called post-millennial because the return of Christ and resurrection come after the millennial golden age.
But it's not a literal millennium.
Well, it is. Yeah, no, it's a literal millennium.
Okay.
I mean, you'll notice the difference. It will not be like it is today. Okay? It'll be will not be a utopia, but it'll be an long era of worldwide peace, prosperity. I mean, that'd be great if it was possible. If you say, however, yes, there is a pre-millennial return of Christ, you're a premillennialist. The return of Christ to earth will conclude the first resurrection of the righteous saints who will reign with Christ on earth. At the end of that, there will be a rebellion of some sort, an apostasy, and then that'll be put down, and there will be a second resurrection of the wicked. Do you notice that premillennialism and postmillennialism have some things in common? There's a rebellion after the millennium, which people like, critics of premillennialism is like, that's weird, that's dumb. He perfects the earth and then allows a rebellion. Well, so does postmillennialism. We're not the only dumb ones then. Okay? Postmillennialism, to just begin to start understanding this, even with the way they interpret passages and put it together, if premillennialism and amillennialism got married and had a baby, it would be postmillennialism. It kind of has certain elements of the... So unlike amillennialism, they take Revelation 19 and 20 as progressive. Revelation 19 and Christ coming with the armies of heaven and the horse and setting up his kingdom leads to the kingdom, the binding of Satan and the glory, and then the apostasy at the end, just like premillennialists take it. Problem is, they take Revelation 19 and the coming of Christ on the horse as not a physical, literal return of Christ, which happens at the end, but as the victory of the gospel through the proclamation. It's a symbol for the victory of the gospel. So it's kind of interesting. It's usually mischaracterized as it's optimistic. Ha ha ha! They used to think that, but not. But then all the world's getting worse and worse and worse. And how can you believe that it's getting better and better? That's a misunderstanding of postmillennialism. It can get worse. It can visibly appear to get worse and worse and worse and worse up until the point that God decides to sovereignly unleash His revival and convert this world. And He could do that at any time. Premillennialism, that's yet future, okay? He will come, then establish his kingdom. Satan will be bound for 1,000 years. He is not yet bound. He is alive and well on planet Earth. He's still doing things and deceiving. And, some places, maybe he's displaced. And then the next couple generations, we lose ground. And then it's a constant battle against the forces of evil until the return of Christ, who vanquishes them. Christ will reign at that time. He's going to return. So whatever you think Jesus is doing in heaven now, at the right hand of the Father, however already that is, there's still this not yet, which is physical and earthly and visible and located. Generally, I don't know any premillennialists who don't locate the kingdom in Jerusalem, but it's, I guess if you can imagine it, it exists. After final apostasy at the end of the millennium, where Satan is released, the second resurrection and final judgment occurs unto condemnation. But then the ushering in of the perfect world where there is no more death or sickness or crying or pain, and all of that has gone away completely. So ascension, present church age, I don't know where we are in this. Maybe we're here. I hope not. I hope we're kind of here-ish. Okay, resurrection of the righteous, Old and New Testament saints, however that works, at the return of Christ. Reign with Christ for 1,000 years over an earth that is, in classic premillennialism, like early church premillennialism, it's progressively being conformed more and more. The new heavens and new earth have kind of already started, but progressively moving toward this perfection. There's a final rebellion, which is very short-lived. I mean, the thing only gets a couple verses in the Bible. There's no tribulation, there's no conflict, there's no war even recorded. It's like, come on, they march and then it's basically God saying, I'm not having none of that. Okay? But then that's it. The eternal state is ushered in. Great white throne judgment, notice resurrection of the wicked. This is what would make you a premillennialist, right here. It's not how long this is. It's not even exactly the nature of this or what's going on. It is resurrection of the saved, the righteous, the elect occurs first. There's a gap, a period of time during which something happens, and a resurrection of the wicked second, after a period of time. If you have anything between resurrection of the righteous and the wicked, then you're a premillennialist. This kingdom in between. Does the kingdom end at the resurrection of the wicked? No. No, 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 no. The kingdom continues on forever and ever and ever, as the Bible, Old and New Testament, clearly say, and as the church has always taught. So a premillennialist doesn't say, well, the difference is they believe that the kingdom is just 1,000 years, where amillennialists believe it goes on forever. No. Premillennialists believe that there is something unique in the progressive unfolding of God's redemptive plan for His people in creation that occurs during that first 1,000 years of the eternal reign and gives way to what continues on forever and ever. There's something unique about this period, and it serves an actual purpose in God's unfolding plan.